Picture this. It's April 1963 at San Fernando Raceway, just north of Los Angeles, the place they called the Pond. It's a warm California afternoon, and past the 1,000-foot mark, something goes very wrong very fast. A front-engine Slingshot dragster, a car burning straight nitromethane at full song, suddenly starts shedding tire. The right rear literally comes apart. The car bites the dirt, noses in violently, launches airborne, and the whole thing comes apart like a cheap watch. The front end breaks off clean, the engine separates from the frame, and takes its own path down the track. Eyewitnesses say the parachutes deployed while the car was still 20 feet off the ground. When it finally stopped, the driver's hand was still on his shoulder, as if he'd pulled the chutes himself. He hadn't. His body just did it on its own. Not long after the crash, a friend watching television called the driver's wife. "I just saw on TV that Bill got killed out at San Fernando," he told her. That's what it looked like from what was being reported. That's what people believed. He wasn't dead, but the man who climbed out of that wreckage wasn't quite the same man who'd climbed in either. And what happened next, what he did next, and how long it took him to do it, that is the actual story here. To understand Bill Alexander, you first have to understand where he came from, because the environment that produced him was not gentle. Southern California in the early 1950s was a very particular kind of place. The war was over, the economy was humming, and there were more young men with access to cheap old cars than at any point in American history. Hot rodding wasn't a hobby yet in the formal sense, it was closer to a street-level religion. The dry lakes at El Mirage, Muroc, and Bonneville were the cathedrals. The concrete riverbed of the Los Angeles River was the neighborhood chapel. The LA River on a Friday night was something. You have to picture this long, flat concrete drainage channel running through the city, lit by whatever headlights the guys brought and the ambient glow of the suburbs around it. Hundreds of spectators sometimes, pit areas, a whole traveling circus that just showed up every week. You could watch Tony Nancy out there, Bob Moravez, who raced under the name Floyd Lippincott Jr. so his parents wouldn't find out, was out there. Tommy Ivo, who they called TV Tommy because he was actually a working television actor, was out there. And running with all of them was a kid from Glendale who'd left home at 16. Bill Alexander, a dyslexic schoolboy from a broken home who found the only thing in the world that felt natural to him, which was going fast in front of people. He joined the Bel Air's car club out of Glendale, and that crew was his family in the most real sense of the word. They ran the river. They ran Glen Oaks Boulevard near the Frosty Freeze. They ran River Road, which later became Forest Lawn Drive. They were out there drawing 400 or 500 people on a good night, and they didn't have any real plan except to be the fastest thing on that strip of ground. One night, the cops showed up mid-race and everybody scattered. Bill, in his coupe, went straight up the dusty bridle trails into Griffith Park and up into the Hollywood Hills to get away. That should tell you something about the kind of person this was. Not waiting around, not arguing, just gone into the dark, fast as he could go. Now, Bill didn't come from money. That needs to be said plainly. His brother-in-law, Marty Elvahoff, had a Slingshot altered over at his place, and Bill got to sit in it when he was about 14 years old. He looked at that thing and told himself, "Someday I'm going to drive one of those." No path to get there, no money, no connections, just the certainty. What he had was nerve and anger, a lot of anger. Cole Kuntz, you interviewed him at length, described the young Alexander as antisocial, misunderstood, and kind of mad at the world. Nobody escaped his agitation, competitors, officials, even teammates. That kind of fury can destroy a person, or it can be redirected into something. For Bill Alexander, it got redirected into his right foot. His brother got drafted and left behind a 1941 Willys. Bill took it to El Mirage without asking permission. He and a buddy had built a D-stroked 265 Chevy with a blower and an injector, and they shattered the C-altered class record. First 155 miles an hour at El Mirage, then 172 at Bonneville, then 181 back at El Mirage. The car handled terribly. He drove it anyway. He didn't know any better, and in a strange way, not knowing was an advantage. After one of those El Mirage runs, he stopped at San Fernando Raceway on the way back, and that's where the camera shop owner, Ernie Alvarado, saw him. Ernie ran out of Glendale selling cameras, and he also happened to own a very serious drag racing car. The next weekend, he walked up to Bill and asked him, "How would you like to drive a dragster?"
Ernie Alvarado's car was called the Shudder Bug. Some wrote it Shudder Bug. The guy ran a camera shop, so the name worked either way. The chassis was built by Kent Fuller, who was one of the best in the business. The body was made by Luigi Lasovsky, an IndyCar builder, which gives you a sense of the caliber of the people Alvarado was running with. At first, the car ran on gasoline with a blown Pontiac. Decent car, fast enough to get noticed. Bill's very first run in a fuel car is worth describing. They took it to San Fernando and loaded it with nitromethane, and Bill left the line. It went about 400 feet, and he was already off the throttle. He idled down to the end, and the crew came running and said, "How was it? How was it?" And he told them, "Oh man, it was great." Lying through his teeth is how he later described it. Lying through his teeth. He made 3 passes that day. The third one went 165 miles an hour, and the gasoline record at the time was 168. That was enough. He knew he could do it. Pretty soon, Alvarado got uncomfortable with having a married driver. Bill had gotten married to his first wife right around this time. He said later the only reason she went out with him was because he drove one of those cars with a parachute on it. And so Alvarado quietly pulled him from the seat and let Tommy Ivo drive the Shudder Bug that winter. Bill watched from the outside. But Bill Alexander was not the kind of man who watched for long. He went to Alvarado with a proposition. "Give me your garage," he said. "Give me the push car, the trailer, and the race car, and I will turn it into a top fuel car with my own money. It won't cost you a penny." He was married with 1 child and another on the way. He was running a drill press during the week. He didn't have any spare money by any definition. He did it anyway. The converted Shudder Bug was a handful. It pulled hard to the right at the 300-foot mark on every single pass without fail, every time. Bill would set up dead straight, and at 300 feet, the car wanted to go into the wall. He learned to manage it. He forced himself to stay in it, and he described eventually reaching a point where he just decided it's either going to get to the other end or it is going to crash, and I don't care which one anymore. Once he got to that mental place, he was fine. "The car taught me everything I know," he said later. "It was an evil little thing, but it taught him how to feel what a fuel car was doing rather than waiting to react to what it had already done. That's a huge distinction in top fuel driving. By the time you see the problem in a car running 200 miles an hour, you're already past it." On December 8, 1962, Bill Alexander drove the Shudder Bug to top eliminator at Lyons Drag Strip. That was a win over the Greer, Black, and Prudhomme car. Let me say that again. He beat the Greer, Black, and Prudhomme car. If you know anything about 1960s drag racing, you know that team. Tom Greer's car, with Keith Black building the engines. Keith Black, yes, that Keith Black, one of the most celebrated engine builders in the history of the sport, and Don Prudhomme driving. Prudhomme, who was already one of the most respected top fuel pilots alive. That combination was about as close to unbeatable as you could find in Southern California that year, and Bill Alexander put the Shudder Bug past all of it at Lyons and took top eliminator. He said afterward it seemed like after that they almost couldn't get beat until the crash. April 1963, The Pond, San Fernando Raceway. They were running elimination rounds, and they'd been dropping tire pressure incrementally all day. You have to understand the logic at the time. Running lower pressure in the rear tires gave you more contact patch, more bite, more traction, and the car had been breaking track records with each round. If 16 pounds of air was good, 15 was better. If 15 was better, 14 was better than that. Classic race driver math, which doesn't account for diminishing returns, or the point at which the tire can no longer hold itself to the wheel. Once they ran the lowest pressure yet. Bill's theory on what happened was that the tire got so low that it finally spun on the wheel at half track and started shedding rubber, and then the right rear let go completely. The car drove hard right into the dirt, nosing in past the 1,000-foot mark, then it launched. People who were there said it cleared the finish line flags while it was still airborne. When it came down, it came apart in all directions. The front half of the car broke off. The engine went one way, Bill went another. Parachutes deployed while the wreckage was still in the air. Mickey Thompson had required Bill to add 2 diagonal bracing bars to the roll cage before the season started. They looked like sissy rails to a lot of people at the time. Those bars almost certainly saved his life. Track guys Dave Wallace and Harry Hibbler got to him in the wreckage. Harry looked at him and said, "God damn it, don't you die!" Bill rolled his eyes back, and Harry thought that was it. He was alive. He was wrecked up, but alive. Back at home, the phone rang. His wife picked up. A friend on the other end had just been watching television and called to tell her that Bill had gotten killed out at San Fernando. That's how it came across on TV. That's what the reports looked like. Now, nobody called this crash a turning point at the time. There was no revelation in the immediate aftermath. He was just a guy who crashed a dragster and survived. But here's what it did do. It gave him a nickname. When he came back to racing not long after, under a new arrangement with an engine builder named Jim Brissette, he came out of the box running faster and quicker than he had ever had before, flat out from his very first pass back. No hesitation, no flashback, just on the throttle all the way through. The guy in the tower that day watched it and said something over the PA about Old Wild Bill, and that was that. The name stuck.
Jim Brissette is someone you need to know about here because he becomes a central figure in the rest of this story. Brissette was an engine builder from Southern California and one of the genuinely gifted ones, the kind of guy who understood horsepower in an almost intuitive way. He'd go on later to win NHRA World Championships, Kelly Brown's title in 1978 and Joe Amato's in 1992, and NHRA would eventually note that Jim Brissette held the distinction of wrenching both the first 200-mile-an-hour and the first 300-mile-an-hour runs at Pomona Raceway, which happened to be about 28 years apart. He was that good. He died in July 2023 at age 81, and the drag racing world lost a real one. But in 1963, he was a young engine builder with a lot of ambition and a dragster chassis that needed a driver. A mutual friend named Everett Brammer, who went by the nickname Hippo, brokered the deal. Brissette said he'd put his motor in Hippo's car if Alexander drove it. Alexander said he'd drive if Brissette tuned it. Both shook on it, and the partnership was born. The car they ended up with was called the Backmotor Car, and that name was descriptive. The chassis was built by Woody Gilmore's race car engineering shop. It was the fifth car out of Gilmore's shop, and the motor plate sat just 20.5 inches from the rear axle. The whole car weighed 1,190 pounds, with virtually all of that weight sitting directly over the drive wheels. The wheelbase was 144 inches. They started with a 354 cubic inch Chrysler Hemi on nitromethane, though the displacement changed more than once over the life of the car as Brissette kept experimenting, and the thing worked. The problem was it worked almost too well. Bill would describe it this way. In the first round of an event, nobody wanted to run them. By the second round, everybody wanted to run them, because by then they knew the connecting rods were coming out at half track. Brissette was making serious horsepower, and the car was working the motor that hard. They'd run 206 miles an hour and 1/10 of a second quicker than anyone else, and the engine would let go. Bearings, rods, whatever gave first, and then the fingers started pointing at the driver, said he was driving it too hard. Biddle's response to that was that you can't drive a car too hard when you're running 206 and 1/10 ahead of the field. That's not the driver's problem, that's the tuner's problem. But here's the thing about Jim Brissette. He was not going to give up horsepower. That was not happening. And Bill Alexander was not going to lift. That was not happening either. So they ran the Backmotor Car hard and fast and spectacular, and with a lot of mechanical carnage. And they did something that not many cars in 1964 were doing. August 22, 1964, at Fontana Drag Strip, the Backmotor Car ran a 7.501 elapsed time. That was the second quickest elapsed time in drag racing history at that exact moment. And somewhere in that same stretch of time, running at San Fernando and other Southern California strips, they cracked 200 miles an hour. The gas record at Pomona was still 168 when Bill had first tried fuel. Now they were running 202, then 202 and change. The car was doing things nobody expected a 1,190-pound slingshot to do. Then, on November 8, 1964, at Pomona Raceway, Bill Alexander and the Backmotor Car became the first person to run 200 miles an hour at Pomona. Exactly 200 miles an hour. That track hadn't seen it before. He was the one who got there first. By the start of 1965, Bill Alexander was one of the most respected and feared top fuel drivers in Southern California. He was running a drill press during the week. He was taking 33% of the purse money whenever the car won. He'd learned that lesson after watching Alvarado's Shudder Bug make what he described as a ton of money and not getting a cent of it. He also packed his own parachute on every pass. His rule, his responsibility. February 1965, the NHRA Winternationals at Pomona.
This was one of the biggest events in the sport, and for 1965, it carried even more weight because ABC's Wide World of Sports was there to film it. This was drag racing on national television, not tape-delayed regional coverage, national television. Bill Alexander made the final round. His opponent was Don Prudhomme, driving Roland Leong's the Hawaiian. Now, if you were paying attention earlier, you'll remember that Prudhomme was the driver when Alexander beat the Greer Black and Prudhomme car at Lyons back in 1962. This is a different car entirely. Roland Leong's operation was its own thing, separate from the Greer Black Prudhomme team, but the name across the line was the same, Don Prudhomme. By 1965, already on a very short list of the very best top fuel drivers alive. Precise, fast, and he did not give things away. Bill got the whole shot. He was quicker off the line, and he had the lead, but Prudhomme made up the difference by mid-track and ran 7.76 to win the race, his first NHRA national event win, the first of what would eventually be 49. That run at Pomona in 1965 started the whole chain for Prudhomme. Bill got runner-up on national television in front of more people than had ever watched a drag race. He wasn't happy about losing, but there aren't many men who could say they pushed Don Prudhomme to a hole shot in a Winternationals final and nearly held him off. That's the position Bill Alexander was in that afternoon. Over the next couple of years, he wheeled nearly a dozen different nitro-burning dragsters. The Backmotor Car when it was running, Bill Wishart's top fuel car, the Kaplan and Tadlock AAFD. He had a brief stint in Peters and Frank's legendary Freight Train, which was a twin-engine blown Chevrolet top gas car. Honestly, one of the wildest pieces of machinery in the history of the sport. By most accounts, that stint didn't go particularly well, and Bill would have been the first to tell you that. He drove for the Moonlighters and the Wreath Automotive cars, too. If someone had a competitive fuel car in Southern California in the mid-60s, there's a decent chance Bill Alexander sat in it at some point. The reputation was built on one thing above everything else. The people who ran against him knew that the guy in the other lane was not going to quit. He was not going to lift. He was not going to let the car come to him. That dragster was going to the other end, or it was going to crash. And from everything his competitors said, he treated both outcomes with roughly equal indifference. That's a terrifying thing to be racing against.
But here's where this story takes a turn that most people don't see coming, and honestly, it's the turn that makes everything else mean what it means. 1971, the NHRA Winternationals, Pomona. Bill Alexander qualified 31st in a 32-car field and lost in the first round to the 15th qualifier, Kenny Safford. That's not a dramatic exit. There's no crash, no big moment. He just lost in round one and went home. Here's what that event was. That 1971 Winternationals was the same race where Don Garlits debuted the rear-engine Swamp Rat XIV, the car that changed everything. Garlits had already lost half of 1 foot in an engine explosion in a front-engine car, and he'd come back with a completely different concept: motor behind the driver, driver out of the blast zone. And the rear-engine car was fast. It was faster than the Slingshots, and it was safer. And within 18 months, the front-engine Slingshot had essentially vanished from top fuel racing. Bill Alexander was not interested in driving a rear-engine car. He'd said so, and the evidence of what he did next bears it out completely. He walked away from professional drag racing in 1971, and he did not come back for 30 years. 30 years! Think about what happens in 30 years. He had his whole career ahead of him when he stopped, and he just stopped. He kept working. He had a son named Rod. At some point, his first marriage ended. The nitro-burning world he'd been part of kept spinning without him. Prudhomme won these championships. Garlits kept going. The sport kept evolving, and none of it had Bill Alexander in it. He was a drill press operator from Glendale, California, who had once beaten the Greer Black and Prudhomme car at Lyons and ran 202 miles per hour and made a Winternationals final on national television, and now he was just a guy. If you asked him during those 30 years what he did on weekends he wasn't racing, he wasn't building, he wasn't connected to the sport at any level anybody has been able to document, he just stepped out. Here's what I find worth thinking about. In those same 30 years, drag racing went from front-engine Slingshots burning nitro to 300-mile-per-hour rear-engine cars with parachutes and funny cars doing 260. The sport got corporate, it got sponsored, it got televised properly. All the things that make modern NHRA what it is today got built in those 3 decades, and all of it happened while Bill Alexander was somewhere running a drill press and not talking about it. Then the nostalgia scene appeared. In the early 1990s, something started happening in California. People started pulling out their old front-engine Slingshots or building new ones styled after the originals and running them on nitromethane at places like Pomona Raceway outside Bakersfield. The Smokers March Meet, which had been running since 1959, became the centerpiece of this thing, and other events started appearing where you could watch front-engine top fuel cars run for real, not parade laps, not show cars, actual race passes on nitro. Bill Alexander found out about this, and somewhere around the early to mid-1990s, he climbed back into a Slingshot dragster. Whatever age he was at that point, he had a 30-year gap in his logbook. The sport had completely changed around him twice over. None of that mattered at all, because what he had was still there. The feel for the car that the Shudder Bug had beaten into him back in 1960. The willingness to be flat on the throttle when most people would lift. The complete absence of hesitation in a situation that would make most people hesitate. He hooked up with a man named Frank Hedge, who went by the nickname Root Beer Frank, and together they ran the Mastercam AA fuel dragster out of Sunland, California. The car was built on a 1997 Fazacast chassis and ran a 403 cubic inch Chrysler. They took it to the March meet and qualified with a 6.08 second elapsed time at 222 miles an hour. In eliminations, they ran 234. The car was real. But the moment that really defines this comeback, the one that tells you everything about who Bill Alexander was, came at the Good Guys' 40th March meet at Pomona Raceway in 1999. He made the final round. His opponent was the WW2 AA Fuel Dragster. That car's crew chief was a man named Jim Herbert, who went by the Lizard and who had died of a heart aneurysm just 10 days before this race. Herbert's widow, Sherry, had convinced the surviving crew members to keep going and race in his memory. So you have Bill Alexander on one side of the line, this man who hadn't raced seriously in 3 decades and was now here making a final round, and on the other side, a car racing for a dead man's memory. Bill pulled the Mastercam into the staging beams, and the blower straps caught fire from a fuel leak out of the left header bank. Starter Larry Sutton, who had worked Lyon's drag strip back in the day and knew exactly who he was looking at, came in with a fire extinguisher and put it out. They went back to staging, and the straps caught fire a second time. Sutton put it out again. Then he gave the kill sign. The WW2 car won the final, an emotional, posthumous win for Jim Herbert, and Bill Alexander sat there in a car that wouldn't go because of a fuel leak and watched it happen. That's drag racing. Sometimes the story writes itself, and sometimes it writes somebody else's story right in front of you.
He didn't stay down. A new car came together called Ground Zero. The owner was John Irick, also out of Sunland. The chassis was a 1995 Sterling. The engine was a 440 cubic inch Donovan on nitromethane, and that car was properly fast. In 2000, at Las Vegas Motor Speedway, Bill Alexander drove the Ground Zero dragster to a 5.999 elapsed time, 5.999 seconds. He became the 5th man in history to join what they called the Nitronic Research 5-Second Club. To understand what that means, you have to know that the first 5-second pass by a front-engine Slingshot happened in 1996. There were only ever a handful of drivers who got there. Bill Alexander was one of them, in a front-engine dragster running nitro after a 30-year break. Then in 2001, he went to the Bakersfield March meet, and he won it. Tom West from Draglist.com photographed him after the victory and wrote that Bill was pretty stunned after the win and may still be pinching himself. He was running very strong all weekend. He was still running the Ground Zero car at the 2003 March meet. There are photographs. Now, I want to tell you something about what Bill Alexander looked like in this phase of his life versus who he'd been 40 years earlier, because Cole Kuntz, who spent serious time with him, wrote about this in a way that sticks with you. The young Bill Alexander was the angry kid from the broken home, antisocial and kind of mad at the world, as Kuntz put it. The brim of his signature wide black hat pulled down, the energy of someone who was running towards something and away from something at the same time, the noise and the power and the speed serving as an outlet for something that had nowhere else to go. The older Bill Alexander, who climbed back into a Slingshot, had a kinder, gentler demeanor, in Kuntz's words, a new lust for life.
He wasn't running from anything anymore. He wasn't mad at the world. He was just a man who loved driving a fuel car and had found a way to do it again. Same black hat, different man inside it. Kuntz framed the whole arc in a line that's been bouncing around in my head since I first read it. He wrote that alchemy involves the charring of metal, and that Bill Alexander had witnessed that process repeatedly from the cauldron of a cockpit, the fire and the heat and the destruction, and then something different coming out the other side. That's not a bad way to describe a 30-year pause and a comeback. Bill had a son named Rod who raced too, both on water in boat racing and on asphalt in drag racing. Rod Alexander died of a stroke in 2011. He went before his father. Bill had a couple of years to sit with that. Bill Alexander died in early October 2013. The first public notice came from the Jalopy Journal's forum on October 7th of that year. The poster wrote that one of drag racing's true pioneers and heroes had passed away a couple nights ago. No services, no memorial for Bill. Just memories. His first wife had commented on the Top Fuel Wormhole blog a few years earlier, looking for information about his health situation. She wrote that she'd almost forgotten her drag racing days. That's a lot of living compressed into one sentence. There is no Find a Grave entry for Bill Alexander, no Wikipedia page, no Hall of Fame plaque anywhere that I could locate in all my research on this. The NHRA hasn't formally inducted him. The formal record of this sport, the one that gets maintained and cited and pointed to, has very little room for him. But Doug D. from the Bel Air's Car Club posted on the day the news broke and wrote that Bill, to me, was a very good friend. He said he was always ready to listen. The stories, the nostalgia of it all. A great guy. Till we meet again, Bill.
So here's where I land on this one. Bill Alexander beat the Greer Black and Prudhomme car at Lyons in 1962. He made a Winternationals final in 1965 that went out on ABC national television. He ran 202 miles an hour when that was one of the fastest things a front-engine car had ever done on the West Coast. He survived a crash at San Fernando that was reported on television as a fatality. He came back from it and built a whole second career worth of results. Then he stopped for 30 years and came back again, and he came back running into the fives at over 230 miles an hour. The question that was sitting underneath all of this the whole time, and I'll just say it plainly now, is whether the fire in a man like that ever really goes out, or whether it just goes quiet for a while. Whether the dyslexic kid from the broken home who sat in his brother-in-law's Slingshot at 14 and told himself, someday I'm going to drive one of those, ever actually stopped being that person. Whether the anger and the nerve and the refusal to lift, whether any of that changes or whether it just waits. I think we know the answer. A 5.999 at Las Vegas Motor Speedway in the year 2000 answers it pretty clearly. No funeral, no services, just memories, and a wide-brimmed black hat somewhere that carried more miles per hour than most of us will ever know.